Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Suvibhasana, Assistant Professor in DAV College, Chennai. Economic liberalization in 1990s led to the reduction of function of role of state. In this context, private enterprises started delivering services to public. This shift from public enterprises to private enterprises resulted in emergence of other bodies also. Hence, the concept of regulation was born. States make use of economic regulation to achieve a range of non-marketing objectives. These may include consumer protection, safety, health status, etc. All this led to the creation of independent regulatory agencies. And the paper also deals with all the concept of IRAs and fulfillment of social objectives, social policies of regulation in India. The objectives are: first, to know about regulation and trace its evolution in India. The second is discussion about rationale behind regulation in India. The third is to explain the theories of regulation. Defining regulation. The issue of regulation has in recent years led to major debates amongst researchers and practitioners. Regulation can take many forms, and the form of regulation policy adopted in developing countries has shifted over time. During 1960s, state intervention was justified as the market had failed to bring about any development. However, in time, this state-led intervention also failed to bring about the desired economic returns in developing countries. Hence, the role of state regulation was redefined and narrowed to that of ensuring an undistorted policy environment in which efficient markets could cooperate. Deregulation was widely adopted, often as part of structural adjustment programs, with the aim of reducing the regulatory burden on the market economy. According to the World Bank, the regulatory state model implies leaving production to the private sector where competitive markets work well, and using government regulation where significant market failure exists. Regulation may be broadly understood as an effort by the state to address social risk, market failure, or equity concerns through rule-based direction of social and individual action. Dubash states that while regulation in some form has always been a key part of the state role, independent regulatory agencies are distinguished by being separated from the executive branch of government so that they function independently. Moran defines regulation as the administrative technology of controlling business through law-backed specialized agencies. Now, what is the rationale for regulation? The first being neoliberalism. The belief that regulation is a direct consequence of liberalization is shared by many authors. It is also believed that it is not only the reason. Levi-Feuer states that while neoliberalism may well be the dominant discourse, it is not the only discourse available. He suggests that the discourse of regulatory reform and good governance both complements the neoliberal reforms and poses a challenge to some of its simplistic assumptions about the nature of the relations between politics and the economy in general, and the state and the market in particular. Links have also been established between regulation and capitalism, where regulation is seen as both a constitutive element of capitalism, as the framework that enables market, and the tool that moderates and socializes it, the regulation of risk. From this point of view, the history of economic development is the history of regulation. Regulation is a necessary condition for the functioning of the market, not only a compromise between economic imperatives and political and social value. Next is the issue of trust. Regulation is also seen as an issue of trust. Regulation is observed not only in the context of the traditional relations between governments and business, but also within the state, within corporations, and in social arenas. The scope of growth in these various arenas is still to be documented. One of the consequences of regulation has been that it ensures corporate social responsibility. In the past 2 decades, we have also seen an exponential increase of tools for integrating social justice and environmental protection issues into the governance structure of corporations. These tools include environmental management systems, corporate reporting systems, and codes of conduct, third-party certification systems, and ethical investment. Cunningham and Grabowski talk of smart regulation, where there is a mixture of regulatory instruments by the mobilization of new regulatory actors and third parties, and by harnessing the enlightened self-interest of individuals and corporations. One of the most interesting indications of the rise of the regulatory capitalism is, therefore, the rise of new instruments of regulation. Market failure is the next one. Market failure is a condition in which the market mechanism fails to allocate resources efficiently to maximize social welfare. Market failures occur in the provision of public goods, in case of natural monopolies, or asymmetric information, and in the presence of externalities. In such a condition, a situation of monopoly occurs where one firm controls the entire market. It is in such a scenario that regulation is utilized to protect consumer interests. Next is to check anti-competitive practices. Firms may resort to anti-competitive practices such as price fixing, market sharing, or abuse of dominant monopoly power. In such a situation, there have been laws which check such practices. Next is to promote the public interest regulation. Regulation is seen to lead a greater welfare by ensuring fair access, non-discrimination, affirmative action, or any other matter of public importance can provide an important reason for regulation. Some major regulations in this regard in India are: Number 1, support pricing, that is, government offering to buy wheat or rice from farmers at a price which is higher than the market price. Next is the public distribution system, supply of food grains at a price which is lower than the market price. Next is free distribution of piped water and free power to agriculture. These are regulatory decisions to levy zero tariffs which stem from policy stances. Next is the free power to agriculture, which happens before elections, a policy with regulatory but public interest regulation can always be manipulated by lobbies to further their vested interests. One of the chief reasons which is cited in favor of regulatory institutions or regulations as a whole is that it would lead to more welfare, given that it is highly unlikely that the regulator will receive all of the information required to regulate optimally to maximize social welfare. The results of regulation in terms of outputs and prices remain second best to those of a competitive market which centers attention on barriers to entry. The third part of the paper deals with theories of regulation, the first being public interest theories. These theories argue that regulation is required to maximize public interest. Regulation, according to this school of thought, arises from the need to rein in the free exercise of market forces and consumer and producer impulses in cases where such a display can act as an obstacle to the maximization of societal well-being, or to remove externally applied obstacles to market forces when their play is desirable. Private interest theory suggests instead that regulators emerge to serve the private interests of individuals or organized groups. If they also serve the public interest, then that is merely a fortunate side effect of serving private interests. There are many variations of the private interest view, including a Marxist perspective, which sees regulatory agencies as a sort of franchise on public power handed out by the state to private interests. In other words, regulation is seen as a tool which can be manipulated by different interest groups to their advantage using their respective bargaining powers with the regulating machinery. The second is institutionalist theories. These theories focus on the various internal dynamics which determine regulation. Dubash talks of three approaches in this regard, that is, regulatory space, responsive regulation, and a stakeholder model. The concept of regulatory space was put forward by Hanscher and Moran, who argue that in capitalism, companies do provide functions of a public nature. Thus, it becomes imperative to understand how the private companies negotiate and operate in this space and not go into the debate of separation of the private form from the public space. When it comes to the stakeholder model of regulation put forward by Prosser, it argues that regulators cannot function in isolation, as they have to consider the demands of various stakeholder groups. Prosser also takes the argument further and argues for explicit efforts to compensate for inequalities in power or information across different stakeholder groups. Not surprisingly, the main problem with this theory is the challenge of implementation ability, both conceptual and practical. The third approach, that is responsive regulation, talks of maximum interaction to capture all information to have more benefits. For example, trade unions could be involved in occupational health and safety regulation. The idea is that insiders may be the ones with both information and interest to participate effectively. The third part of the paper is with regard to regulation in India. Regulatory institutions emerged in India after the introduction of the economic reforms in 1991. Post-independence, the state in India did have a major control over the economy with private sector activity by the use of licenses and quotas and high tariff walls. Thus, the government was not only a producer and regulator of strategic and important goods and services, it also exerted direct control over the output and sometimes even associated prices of private sector activity. It was only after 1985 that the government loosened its reins over the private sector, but the regulatory environment which has developed over a period of time does not seem homogeneous across sectors. India still ranks very low in terms of the enabling nature of its business environment, and unnecessary regulatory burdens are imposed upon business and investors. Regulation in India can be divided under three broad categories. Economic regulation aims at preventing or tackling market failure. This is achieved with rules that prescribe and punish market distorting behavior. The second category is regulation in the public interest, which dwells in areas the public sector is failing to meet standards or are engaged in matters which are of public importance. Consequences of economic development have important consequences for economic development. Unsafe water, unhealthy air, species and habitat loss, and degradation of soil are some concerns with real world effects sought to be addressed through environmental regulation. The paper also deals with listing of major regulations. Some major regulations, economic or in the public interest, enforced in India are Then there are independent regulatory authorities, that is IRAs in India. Independent sector regulation is a relatively new development in India. The IRAs have been set up in various sectors in India to have more efficiency and consumer protection. Some of the major regulatory authorities in India are power, energy, oil and gas, coal, telecom, ports, airports, roads, railways, water supply and sanitation, and social sector. India has regulators for telecom, power, ports, and petroleum, etc. The distribution of power, the mechanism of functioning differs from sector to sector, with a variety of powers to implement their brief, which differ widely across sector. It has been argued that the regulatory framework in India has been conceived in a hasty manner, as a result of which regulation in India has not been able to achieve the desired effect. The next section illustrates the various problems which plague the regulatory sectors in India. The first problem is of independence. One of the chief requirements of good regulation is to provide the regulatory institutions with independence with regard to functions. The said regulators should have access to funds, fixed tenure, and protection from removal except in case of incompetence. In India, the independence of regulators have been constrained by dependence on ministries for a number of reasons, such as budgetary allocations, recruitment of staff, etc. The second problem is accountability. Accountability of two types, political and legal. Political accountability involves reporting to the line ministry, legislature, which may have a special committee to scrutinize and debate its contents. Legal accountability enables those aggrieved by a regulatory decision to issue a formal complaint or appeal. In India, it is the Parliament which is responsible for ensuring accountability from regulators by way of ensuring that regulatory bodies submit their annual reports. However, these reports are not accorded any seriousness. Moreover, ensuring accountability is a precondition for regulatory legitimacy. The next is transparency. High level of transparency is imperative when it comes to good regulation. Some steps which can be adopted for the same are that all stakeholders must be informed of the various processes which goes on and have the freedom to give their opinion. In certain cases, regulatory legislation in India has made provisions to guarantee a transparent regulatory process. For example, in the electricity and telecom sectors, it has been mandated that regulators should ensure transparency while exercising their powers and discharging functions. The next is the absence of a uniform regulatory framework. In India, there is an absence of a single regulatory framework. Regulatory bodies have come up on the basis of the need of different sectors or due to pressure from a multilateral funding agency. This sectoral approach has resulted in an uneven regulatory environment. Next is regulation and social object. Although public choice theories have argued that regulation leads to greater pursuance of public interest, it has been negated by private interest theorists, which argue regulation would only lead to the benefit of a few in society. The concerns that motivate a social agenda in regulation include issues of access to electricity and water, appropriate pricing for low-income groups, attention to quality of service issues, including special provisions such as those that permit the use of prepaid meters, and related social issues such as the rights of labor employed in the electricity and water sectors. While the regulator is legally, Dubash and Rao give the example of regulation of electricity in India to show there is a fine line between economic and social objectives. While the regulator is legally mandated to reduce cross subsidies, in practice, regulators make political judgments about whether and how much to do so. The next is the appellate tribunals. It has been suggested that the regulators make their decisions public and be confined to appellate courts. This would serve the multiple purposes such as ensuring transparency, accountability, and access to all stakeholders in order to express their opinion. Next is the function of the regulator. to have a good regulation, the onus also lies with the regulator. The regulator should not only be given ample scope for the expansion of their sectors, but at the same time they should ensure that the objectives which have been set out by the state are also met. Regulators should also ensure that they carry the various stakeholders who would be affected by the decision that they take. The role of the regulator is to achieve predetermined policy objectives and maintain competitive conditions in the market by ensuring that everyone follows the basic rules of the game. On the other hand, the role of the policy makers is to provide long-term objectives and vision to the development of a country. Despite the differences in the roles of the regulator and policy maker, their areas do overlap, such as ensuring orderly and sustained growth of the sector, attracting private investment, enhancing consumer protection, and so on. However, there are grounds for skepticism about regulatory institutions, but at the same time, decades of state control over electricity and water services have not inspired confidence. In this model, social gains were intended to be directly addressed by ministries. However, there was little scope for public debate and discussions over what the social goals should be and how they should be addressed. So, the opinion of public ownership and control also offers little guarantee of success. The choice is between imperfect options. It can be concluded that rationale for regulatory measures rests on antitrust, market failure, anti-corruption practices, and public interests. However, there are a list of regulatory policies in India which is very long. However, some of them are Foreign Exchange Management Act 1999, Trade Unions Act 1926, Competition Act 2002, and Companies Act 1956, amongst others. India has regulation for telecom, power ports, and petroleum. However, there are problems with regulatory policies in India, that is of accountability, transparency, and uniformity. I hope the students are now clear about the regulatory policies in India, the various acts which have been enacted by the government from time to time to stop this, and malpractices of the institution that play a role in dealing with public problems. Thank you.